The cathedral had been breathing all evening. That was the only way to describe it. The candles along the stone pillars flickered like something alive. The white orchids imported from 3 different countries exhaled into the cold soul air. The string quartet at the back of the hall played something old and European, something deliberately chosen to signal that tonight was not just a wedding. Tonight was a coronation. Every seat was filled. Politicians, executives, men whose names you would recognize and men whose names were never spoken in public. They were dressed in the language of power, dark suits, quiet jewelry, faces arranged into expressions of dignity and controlled joy. Nobody laughed too loudly. Nobody moved unnecessarily. Because when you were a guest at Tak Sukchin's wedding, you understood instinctively that you were also being watched. Tak stood at the front of the cathedral. He was tall, and the charcoal suit had been made for the exact architecture of his body. The tattoos that crawled up the left side of his neck, dark ink tracing patterns that told a history no biography would ever publish, were the only thing about him that felt uncontrolled. Everything else was geometry. His jaw, his posture, the precise way his hands were folded at his front, fingers interlocked, knuckles unblemished despite a life that should have destroyed them many times over. He was not nervous. Tak Sukchin did not get nervous. Nervousness was a luxury of people who hadn't already calculated every possible outcome. He had calculated this one. He had calculated Veronica Myers with the same cold precision he calculated market positions and territorial agreements. She was from the right family. She moved in the right rooms. She smiled at the right people and remembered their children's names and laughed at the right moments. A perfect asset. A perfect alliance. And she was beautiful, which was not irrelevant. Even Tak understood that beauty served a function in the currency of power. The music shifted. The doors at the back of the cathedral opened, and Veronica appeared. She wore ivory lace with a train that required 2 attendants. Her hair was swept back from her face, exposing the long, deliberate elegance of her neck. She walked slowly, the way someone walks when they know they are being watched, when every step is a sentence in a language they have mastered completely. She smiled at the guests on each side, not too wide, precisely calibrated. She had done the rehearsal 4 times. She had watched footage of herself doing it. When she reached the altar and her eyes met Tak's, she held his gaze with the specific warmth of someone who had decided warmth was the correct expression for this moment. Tak noticed, not for the first time, that her eyes didn't change when she smiled. They stayed the same temperature. He had categorized this quality in her the same way he had categorized it in business rivals. It was a trait he recognized because it was a trait he shared. He had considered it a compatibility. The officiant began to speak. The hall was completely still. And then the side door opened. She didn't rush. That was the first thing. Philomena Rikers walked into the ceremony hall the way someone walks when they have already accepted every consequence of what they are about to do. She was in the plain black uniform of the catering staff. She was young, composed, and she was holding a white envelope in both hands in front of her like something almost ceremonial. The guests turned, one by one, then all at once. The officiant stopped speaking. Veronica's lips pressed together, just slightly, just for a fraction of a second, then she controlled it. Philomena walked directly to Tak, not to a side staff member, not to the wedding coordinator hovering near the pillar. Directly to Tak Sukchin, in front of every person in that cathedral, and she stopped 2 feet in front of him and extended the envelope forward with both hands. She said nothing. The silence in that cathedral was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of 500 people simultaneously deciding not to breathe. Tak looked at her face. He had learned long ago that faces told you more than words ever would, and her face told him something he couldn't immediately categorize, which itself was unusual. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid for something else, something she was protecting. He looked at the envelope. His name was written on it by hand. Neat, small letters, not urgent, careful. He took it. Philomena stepped back 1 step and waited. Tak turned the envelope over in his hands once. He looked at Veronica. Her expression had arranged itself back into composed concern, the face of a bride whose ceremony has been interrupted by something she is graciously tolerating. Her hands were folded at her waist. Her jaw was perfectly set. But her left thumb was pressing into her right palm. Tak opened the envelope. He did not step away. He did not go to a private room. He stood exactly where he was, at the altar, in front of every person he had ever done business with, and he unfolded the paper inside. The sound of it unfolding was the loudest thing in the room. He read the first paragraph, then he stopped. He read it again. His body did not move. His expression did not change. But something behind his eyes recalculated completely, the way a room looks different the moment you understand that what you thought was a wall is actually a door. He had a daughter. 4 years old, biological, confirmed. He read it a third time. Then he folded the paper with the same precision he'd unfolded it, placed it in the interior pocket of his jacket, directly against his chest, and looked up. He looked at the officiant first. His voice was quiet and absolutely clear. He said he needed a moment. The officiant nodded. Tack looked at Veronica. He said her name once, just her name, the way you say a word when you are testing whether it still means what you thought it meant. She met his eyes. She touched the pearl at her throat, and she smiled, a smaller smile now, private, reassuring, and she said of course there was nothing he needed to know. She said this was simply some disruption. She said these things happened at large events and they should continue, because the officiant and the guests and the flowers and the evening were all waiting, and this was their moment, and nothing that happened in the last 60 seconds changed anything about what they were to each other. Tack listened to all of it. Then he nodded slowly and said, they could not continue. The sound that went through that cathedral was not a gasp. It was deeper than that. It was the sound of 500 people recalibrating everything they thought they understood about the next 5 minutes, the next 5 years, the next arrangement of power in this city. Someone in the back knocked over a glass. It shattered against the marble floor like a small gunshot. Veronica's smile disappeared. Tack did not look at the broken glass. He did not look at the guests standing from their seats or at Veronica's mother rising from the front row like something coming to a boil. He kept his eyes on Veronica, and he said, still quiet, still with the voice he used in rooms where very bad things were being decided very carefully, that the paper in his pocket was a DNA test, that it showed the existence of a child connected to him by blood, a child he had never been told about. Not once. Not in a year. Veronica's face held for 3 full seconds. It was impressive, in the way that a controlled demolition is impressive. You can see the structure fighting to stay upright even as everything beneath it is already gone. Then she laughed. She said the idea was ridiculous. She said someone was running a scheme. She said Tack, of all people, should know how enemies operated, and this had enemy written all over it. Tack did not laugh. He looked at her the way he looked at a contract, when he already knew it had been altered. And the cathedral, which had been breathing all evening, went completely still. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. I want to see it. And if you've never been here before, this channel is where stories like this live, the kind that don't let you walk away. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell, because what's coming in the next 2 hours is not something you want to find in the middle. Now, back to Tack. Because here is what nobody in that cathedral understood yet, and what Tack himself was only beginning to calculate in the freezing silence behind his eyes. He had spent his entire life believing that control was the highest form of power. That if you understood every variable, you could not be surprised. That emotion was a vulnerability, and love was a liability, and human connection was a weakness his enemies could exploit. He had built an empire on that belief. And standing at his own altar, with a piece of paper pressed against his chest that proved a 4-year-old child existed somewhere in this city. His child, blood of his blood, he understood, with the clinical precision that had made him the most feared man in 3 provinces, that he had been played. Not by an enemy. By the woman in the ivory lace dress, standing 3 feet in front of him. And the woman who had played her from behind the curtain. The most dangerous person in the room isn't the man with the gun. The string quartet had stopped. One of the violinists was still holding her bow midair, frozen. The candles on the pillars kept burning, indifferent. The white orchids kept exhaling. Tack reached into his jacket pocket and touched the edge of the folded paper once. 4 years. He had a daughter for 4 years, and someone in this room had made sure he never knew. He looked at Philomena Rikers, who was still standing exactly one step behind him, exactly where she had placed herself when she delivered the envelope. She had not run. She had not apologized. She was waiting with the patience of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this specific moment to arrive. He had seen her face somewhere. He was certain of it. He just didn't know yet where. She's not just a waitress. He would understand that soon enough. He turned back to the room, to the politicians and executives and men with unspoken names, all of them watching him, all of them already deciding what this fracture meant for their own arrangements, their own alliances, their own futures that had been built around the assumption of Tak Suk-chin's absolute, unassailable control. He let them watch. He straightened his jacket. And in the voice that had ended careers and rearranged territories and made men in boardrooms forget their own names, he told the room the wedding was over. He said it the way you close a door. Was the power worth the price of the life you almost missed? That question was going to follow Tak Suk-chin for the next 120 minutes. It was going to follow him through the wreckage of his reception hall, through the surveillance files his people were about to uncover, through the photographs taken of a woman and a small girl by a private investigator working for a woman who had sat in the front row of this cathedral and cried beautiful, rehearsed tears. It was going to follow him to a park bench, where a 4-year-old girl with his jaw and his eyes, and none of his coldness, was going to look up at a tall man in a very expensive suit and have no idea that she was looking at the most feared man in the country. And that she was also looking at her father. She's not just a waitress. Tell me everything. How long? The cathedral had a different quality now that it was empty. Spaces reveal themselves when the people filling them leave. Strip out 500 bodies and the acoustics change, the proportions shift, and what was designed to feel solemn becomes something starker. The vaulted ceiling that had cradled music an hour ago now amplified the sound of a single candle guttering in a draft from the closed doors. The white orchids on the tables looked less like decoration and more like evidence of an intention that had not survived the evening. Tak had not moved from the altar. He stood in the same position, with the same geometry, and looked at Philomena Rikers with the concentrated attention of a man who had built an empire on the accurate reading of people, and understood that what was standing in front of him had not yet been accurately read. Veronica remained at the altar's edge, 3 feet to his left, though she had shifted her weight in the last few minutes from both feet to her right, a minor adjustment that told him her certainty had redistributed itself. Her mother sat in the front pew with her hands folded over her clutch bag, and her face arranged into the expression of a woman waiting for the situation to present her with a lane she could navigate. Choi had not moved from the pillar. Tak looked at Philomena and said simply, "Start." She didn't rush into it. He noted this. People who were performing a rehearsed account rushed, because momentum concealed the seams. People telling the truth often paused first, locating the right beginning the way you locate the correct thread in a knot, not by pulling hard, but by finding the one that moves. "I worked for your catering company," she said. "The subsidiary, the one that services private events. I've been on the roster for 14 months. "You were placed there," Tak said. "It wasn't a question." "I chose it," she said, "because it was the only access point that didn't require going through your gate or your office. I knew everything else would be closed." "Why did you know that?" She held his gaze. "Because I spent 3 months trying everything else first." Veronica made a sound, not quite a word, more the architecture of one, the shape of an objection before its content arrives. Tak raised one finger from his folded hands without looking at her, and the sound stopped. "She's not just a waitress," he said, still to the room, still with that quiet that functioned like a hand around a throat. "So tell me what she is." Philomena's jaw shifted slightly. Not discomfort, the adjustment of someone deciding how much of a truth to release and in what order. "The child's mother," she said, "is my cousin. Her name is Cheryl. She left Seoul 4 years ago when she realized she was pregnant. She left because she was afraid." "Of me," Tak said. "Of what might happen to her if the wrong people found out whose child she was carrying. She'd seen what proximity to you did to people who weren't protected by your organization. She didn't know if she qualified as protected. She decided not to find out." The logic was sound, and he knew it. 4 years ago, his operation had been in a period of consolidation that had not been gentle. Cheryl's fear had not been irrational. It had been, in fact, a correct read of his world. This did not make the 4 years smaller. "Where is she now?" he asked. "Busan. She runs a small alterations business. She's been doing it alone." Philomena paused. "Sari is healthy. She's in a good school. Cheryl made a life." Tak absorbed this without expression. In his chest, behind the charcoal jacket and the folded DNA test, something was moving that he had no immediate category for. He was a man who categorized everything. The absence of a category was its own form of information. "How long," he said, "have you known about me specifically, that I was the father?" "Cheryl told me 2 years ago. She made me promise to say nothing. Then 8 months ago she got sick." Philomena's voice didn't break. It compressed slightly, like a structure taking load. Nothing fatal, but serious enough that she started thinking about what happened to Sari if something happened to her. A child with no documented father, no network, no protection in a city where protection is a currency. She looked at him directly. "She changed her mind about telling you." 8 months ago, Tak said. "Yes. And the letters you sent." "The first one was returned unopened with no explanation. The second one I hand-delivered to your residential gate. Your man there accepted it, confirmed my name, told me it would reach you." She paused. "It didn't. The third I sent through a lawyer-registered post to your business address. I received a letter back, signed by someone in your administrative office, informing me that the matter had been reviewed and was considered a fraudulent claim." The last 3 words arrived in the cathedral and sat there. Tak turned his head toward Choi with the slow deliberateness of a mechanism that has decided on its direction and will not be redirected. Choi was looking at the floor. His jaw was set. He had the posture of a man who has decided that the accounting is coming and is choosing not to run from it. "Who reviewed it?" Tak said, not to Choi, to the air between them. Choi looked up. His eyes went briefly, just briefly, to Veronica's mother in the front pew, then back to Tak. "I was told it was standard procedure for unverified external claims. I was told the legal team had assessed it." "Were you told what the claim was?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to confirm what Tak already knew. "Not specifically." "How long have you been receiving instructions from a source outside my direct authority?" The question didn't rise at the end. It remained flat, level, and more dangerous for it. Choi said nothing for 4 seconds. Then, "The instructions came through the household coordination channel. I believed they were sanctioned." "You've betrayed the wrong man." Tak didn't say it. He stored it in the part of his mind where consequences were organized and managed and eventually delivered, and he turned back to Philomena. "The 4th attempt," he said. "Tonight." Tonight was the only remaining window where your security would be divided between the venue and the perimeter. Large guest lists require distributed attention. I knew if I was already inside as staff, already vetted and badged for the event, there was no gate to be turned away from. She looked at him steadily. "I've been on the catering roster for 14 months, Mr. Tak. I took every event your company hosted in case one of them gave me access to you directly." This was the first one that did. 14 months. He measured it against the 4 years, against the 8 months since Cheryl changed her mind, against the 3 failed letters, against the hired surveillance he didn't yet know the full details of but could already feel the shape of from the information currently assembling itself in front of him. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning of the 8 months. Every attempt, every contact, every person you spoke to. Leave nothing out." Philomena began. She spoke for 11 minutes without interruption. Tak listened the way he listened in negotiations, completely, without reaction, cataloging not just content but sequence and texture, the way certain names made her voice tighten and certain dates made her pause as if the memory of them still had weight. By the time she finished, the picture that had assembled itself in his mind was not merely a picture of a woman trying to reach him. It was a picture of a system. A coordinated, resourced, deliberate system designed to ensure that a specific piece of information never arrived. Veronica had not spoken since the single aborted sound 30 minutes ago. She stood with her hands folded, and her eyes moving between Tak's profile and some middle distance that offered her nothing. The ivory lace of her dress had acquired a different quality in the emptied cathedral, no longer bridal, no longer ceremonial. It looked now simply like an expensive choice made in anticipation of an outcome that had not materialized. It was her mother who spoke first. "Tack." Her voice was measured and carried the particular authority of a woman who understood that authority was a performance and had been performing it for longer than most people in this city had been paying attention. "What you're hearing tonight is a targeted disruption designed by people who have a great deal to gain from destabilizing this alliance. I want you to consider very carefully." "I want you to stop speaking," Tack said. She stopped. "You will speak when I ask you a question," he said. "You have not been asked a question." The silence that followed had a different texture than the cathedral's earlier silences. It was smaller, more intimate. The silence of a room that has contracted to contain only the people in it, stripped of ceremony and audience and the protective buffer of occasion. Veronica looked at her mother. Her mother looked at Tack. And in that exchange, in the microarchitecture of those two glances, Tack saw the seam. The place where the construction showed itself for what it was. Not two women responding separately to a crisis. Two women who had been operating from the same playbook and were now, for the first time, uncertain whose name was on the cover. "How long," Tack said, turning to Veronica, "did you know Cheryl existed?" Veronica's composure held for one more breath. One more beat of the constructed, practiced, magnificent facade she had maintained through 14 months of lies, and a cathedral full of witnesses, and a DNA test read at her own altar. Then she said, "That isn't a simple question." "It is," he said. "It has a number in the answer. Give me the number." She looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time since the envelope arrived, without the layer of performance between her eyes and his. And what he saw in that unguarded moment was not the villain he might have expected. It was something more uncomfortable than that. It was a woman who had told herself a story about what she was doing and why, and had believed it completely, and was now in the first seconds of understanding that the story had a different ending than she'd written. "Since before we were engaged," she said quietly. The candle nearest the altar guttered again. Neither of them looked at it. Tack nodded once, slowly. The way you nod when a number confirms a calculation you were hopping was wrong. He looked at Choi. "Bring the car around. One car, just the driver." He looked at Philomena. "You're coming with me." Then, finally, back to Veronica and to the woman in the front pew in the steel-gray silk who had still not moved and whose hands had tightened on the clutch bag until the knuckles showed. "Neither of you leaves this building until my people arrive. You will be taken somewhere comfortable and you will wait." Veronica's mother opened her mouth. Tack looked at her and she closed it. He straightened his jacket. He touched the exterior of his pocket once, where the paper was. Then he walked down the aisle of the empty cathedral, past the broken glass that was still on the floor, past the guttering candles and the arranged orchids, toward the door with Philomena 3 steps behind him and Choi already moving to comply. At the door he stopped. He didn't turn around. He spoke to the room he was leaving. "Who told you to burn them?" he said. It wasn't directed at anyone specifically. It was a question he was going to need answered. It was a question that was going to dismantle several things he had believed about his operation, his household, and the people he had trusted to manage the seams of his life. He already knew some of the answers. The rest he was going to find in Busan. "Who told you to burn them? Do not lie to me." The cathedral door opened, and the cold night air came through, and Tak Suk-chin walked out of his own wedding into the dark, with the name of a daughter he had never met pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat. The office had been built to intimidate. Not overtly, Tak had never trusted overt intimidation, which was the province of men who needed their power confirmed by the reactions of others. This room intimidated through precision. Floor-to-ceiling glass on the eastern wall overlooking the city grid below. Furniture with the clean, unornamented lines of things that cost more than most people's annual income. A desk that held nothing unnecessary. No photographs. No decorative objects. The only thing on that desk that could be considered personal was the clock. A small, antique chiming piece his mother had kept on the windowsill of their apartment in a neighborhood that no longer existed. In a version of his life he had systematically dismantled and replaced. It was past midnight. The clock read 12:41. Tak had changed out of the wedding suit. He wore now what he wore when the performance of power was unnecessary, dark trousers, a collarless shirt with the sleeves pushed to the elbow, the tattoos on his forearms fully visible in the low desk light. He was seated. Philomena had been taken to a secure room on the floor below, given food, and told she would be needed again shortly. Choi stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking at the city the way a man looks at something familiar when he is trying to avoid looking at something else. Across the desk sat Tak's personal assistant, Ryun. Ryun was 31 years old and had worked in this office for 6 of them. He was organized with a precision that had made him invaluable. He knew Tak's schedule, his preferences, his communication protocols, his dietary restrictions during periods of high operational stress. He knew which calls to intercept and which to push through. He knew, which was the relevant point this evening, exactly what arrived in Tak's incoming correspondence and exactly what did not. He was sitting with his hands flat on his thighs and his eyes directed at the desk surface between them, and he had the specific stillness of a man who understands that movement will be interpreted as guilt and has decided that stillness is his only remaining strategy. Tak looked at him for a long time without speaking. The clock on the desk chimed once for the quarter hour. The sound of it moved through the room and dissolved. "Who told you to burn them?" Tak said. Ryun's hands pressed slightly harder against his thighs. The fabric of his trousers absorbed the pressure without showing it, but the tendons in his wrists showed it clearly. "I don't know what specific correspondence." Ryun. The name, spoken that way, accomplished what no raised voice could. Ryun stopped. "There were letters," Tak said. "Multiple, sent across an 8-month period by a woman named Philomena Rikers to my residential address, my registered business address, and through a lawyer's office to this building's administrative intake. I have a first-hand account of each attempt." He paused. "None of them reached me, which means each of them was received and redirected by someone with knowledge of my incoming systems." Another pause, fractional. "You are the only person, outside of Choi, with unrestricted access to all 3 of those channels simultaneously." Ryun looked up. His face had the quality of a man who had prepared several versions of an answer, and was now discovering that none of them fit the shape of the question being asked. "Do not lie to me," Tak said. Quiet, absolute. "Do not construct something. Do not give me a partial truth arranged to look complete. I will know, and what comes after that will be considerably worse than what comes after honesty." The city blinked beyond the glass wall. Somewhere below, a siren moved through the grid and faded. Ryun exhaled. "Mrs. Myers," he said. "Veronica's mother. She contacted me through a number I didn't recognize 4 months before your engagement was announced. She told me she was working on behalf of your interests. She said there was an ongoing attempt by outside parties to deliver fraudulent paternity claims to you, that it was a known tactic used against men in your position to create leverage, and that your legal team had already been briefed to flag and neutralize any such attempts before they reached you." Tak's expression did not change. "She told you your legal team had sanctioned the interception." "Yes." "And you verified this with my legal team." Ryun's silence lasted 3 seconds. "She provided documentation, a memo on your legal firm's letterhead signed by the senior partner." "Forged," Tak said. "I didn't know that." "You didn't verify it." "No," Ryun said. The word cost him something. It showed in the muscles of his jaw. Tak looked at Choi. "The memo, can it be retrieved?" Choi said, "I'll have it by morning." "Ryun." Tak's attention returned to his assistant with the quality of a laser that has found its surface. "The first letter, when it arrived, walk me through exactly what you did with it." Ryun walked him through it. All of it, in the sequence it had occurred, in the precise administrative language of a man who had convinced himself at each stage that he was executing a legitimate protocol. The first letter returned unopened, per the instruction. The second accepted at the gate by Choi's Jr., passed to Ryun. Documented in the intake log under the fraud flagging category, Mrs. Myers had instructed him to create, and filed in a physical folder that had since been, he paused here, removed from the filing system. "Removed," Tak said. Mrs. Myers requested the physical file at the 8-month mark. She said it was needed for the legal team's ongoing assessment. "And you gave it to her?" She came to this office personally. She signed for it. Ryan swallowed. I thought it was routine. Tak stood up. It was not a dramatic movement. He didn't push the chair back or place his hands on the desk. He simply rose, with the economy of someone who has decided that sitting is no longer the appropriate geometry for this conversation, and walked to the eastern window. He stood with his back to the room and looked at the city below, the grid of it, the lights, the infrastructure of a place he had spent 15 years learning to navigate and control, street by street and connection by connection. He had a daughter who had been alive for 4 years and 3 months in a city 300 kilometers south of this window. She had his hands. He had not known her name until 90 minutes ago. And the mechanism that had kept her from him had not been constructed by an enemy. It had been constructed inside this building. Inside his systems, his channels, his carefully organized world, by a woman who had sat in the front pew of his wedding tonight in steel-gray silk and cried rehearsed tears. The ghost in this office, he thought, wore a visitor's badge and signed the intake log. He turned around. The lawyer, he said to Ryan. The third attempt. Registered post to the administrative address. A letter from a lawyer's office on Philomena's behalf. Ryan nodded carefully. It was flagged under the same protocol. I drafted the response myself, informing the sender that the claim was assessed as fraudulent and would not be entertained. On whose signature did you send it? Ryan looked at the desk surface again. Mine, he said, under the administrative office header. So a lawyer, acting on behalf of a woman trying to inform me of my own child's existence, received an official letter from my administrative office declaring the information fraudulent. Tak let this sit in the room for a moment, and the lawyer would have had no reason to question the authority of that response. No, Ryan said, they wouldn't have. Choi shifted his weight near the window. It was a minimal movement, barely perceptible, but in the silence of the office at 12:50 in the morning, it registered like a sound. Tak looked at him. The gate, Tak said. The second letter. Philomena delivered it in person. Your junior accepted it. Yes, Choi said. He reported it to you. A pause, not the pause of a man constructing a lie. Choi had moved past that option 20 minutes ago, and both of them knew it. It was the pause of a man measuring the weight of what he is about to put down. He flagged it to me as an unverified external contact, attempting personal access. I logged it under the fraud protocol Ryan had circulated. When did Ryan circulate that protocol? Choi looked at Ryan. Ryan looked at the desk. The week after Mrs. Myers's first contact, Ryan said. She recommended formalizing the flagging procedure. She said it would protect your operational integrity during the pre-engagement period. Tak absorbed the timeline. Mrs. Myers had contacted Ryan before the engagement was even announced, which meant the interception system had been built before Philomena made her first attempt, which meant the woman in the steel-gray silk had known about Cheryl's decision to come forward before Philomena had acted on it, which meant there was a surveillance apparatus, something that had been watching Cheryl and Philomena in Busan, monitoring communications, anticipating moves, that predated everything Tak had known about this situation by a significant margin. He walked back to the desk. He did not sit down. He stood behind the chair and placed one hand on its back. You've betrayed the wrong man, he said. He said it to both of them, not as a threat. The threat was implicit in everything about his tone and presence, and the late hour and the specific quality of his attention. He said it as information. A correction of a misunderstanding they had operated under for months. They had looked at Tak Suk-chin and calculated, with Mrs. Myers's guidance, that his operation was manageable from within, that the systems could be quietly redirected, that he would not notice, or would not be able to trace it if he did. The miscalculation was understandable. Most people who made it didn't get the opportunity to understand it clearly afterward. Ryan, he said, you will remain in this building tonight. In the morning, you will provide my security team with a complete written account of every communication you had with Mrs. Myers, dates, content, the forged documentation, the physical file she collected. Everything. He paused. If the account is complete and accurate, I will determine next steps accordingly. If it is not complete, I will determine next steps accordingly. The difference between those two outcomes is significant. Ryan nodded. He looked like a man who had just understood, with full clarity, the difference between the life he was living an hour ago and the life he was living now. Tak looked at Choi. Choi met his eyes without flinching. Of the two men in this room, Choi was the one whose betrayal had the most weight, because Choi's loyalty had been the longest and the closest, and because Choi had looked at the forged protocol and chosen not to ask the question that a man of his experience should have asked. "You knew something was wrong," Tak said. "It was not a question, it was a reading." Choi said, "I had a doubt, I didn't follow it." "Why?" A long pause. Honest, this time. "Because following it meant asking questions that would have put me between you and Mrs. Myers before the engagement, and I calculated that the risk of that position was higher than the risk of the doubt." Tak looked at him for a very long time. "Go home," he said. "We'll speak tomorrow." Choi left. Ryun was collected by two of Tak's security personnel, who materialized with the quiet efficiency of people who had been waiting in the corridor for exactly this instruction. The office was empty. Tak stood at the desk in the low light, alone for the first time since the cathedral, and looked at the antique clock his mother had kept on the windowsill. It read 1:07. It chimed once softly. Into the silence of a room from which every ghost had been, at least temporarily, removed. He thought about Sari, 4 years and 3 months. Her name, when Philomena had said it, had done something to the air in the cathedral that he still didn't have a category for. He reached for his phone. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it face down on the desk and looked at the city instead. He had spent 15 years building systems to protect everything that mattered to him. Not one of those systems had known she existed. "Do not lie to me. Who told you to burn them?" The answers were assembling themselves, piece by documented piece, into a shape that was larger and more deliberate than he'd calculated in the cathedral. And at the center of that shape, in the steel-gray silk, sat a woman who had not yet been asked a single question. That conversation was coming. First, he needed to know exactly how far her reach had extended, not into his office, not into his gate. Into Busan. Into the street where his daughter walked to school. The file arrived at 6:14 in the morning. Tak had not slept. He had not tried. He had spent the hours between Choi's departure and dawn at the eastern window with a glass of water he didn't drink, watching the city grid below transition through its nocturnal rhythms. The last service vehicles, the early delivery runs, the gradual brightening of the eastern horizon that the glass wall framed like a painting of a thing rather than the thing itself. When his security chief, a compact, methodical woman named Seo who had worked intelligence before she worked for him, placed the physical folder on his desk at 6:14, he was already seated, already waiting. "Everything we pulled from the administrative intake archive," she said, "cross-referenced with the external surveillance documentation we recovered from the file Mrs. Myers signed out." She paused. There was a secondary file. She didn't know we maintained digital shadows of physical records. It was in the backup system under a routing number that hadn't been audited in 18 months. Tak looked at the folder. It was thicker than it should have been for something that was supposed to not exist. "How long did it take you to find it?" 3 hours, Seo said, "once I knew what I was looking for." He opened it. The first section was administrative. The forged legal memo Ryun had described, the intake logs, the flagging protocol documentation with Mrs. Myers's fingerprints all over its language and architecture. He moved through this efficiently, not because it was unimportant, but because he had already mapped its shape from last night's conversation. Confirmation was not the same as discovery. The second section stopped him. It was a surveillance log. Printed, not digital, someone had been careful enough to avoid leaving an electronic trail at the source, which meant the original had been generated outside his systems entirely. But the routing number on the backup had captured a scanned copy, and what Tak was looking at now was a 14-month record of coordinated observation conducted on 2 subjects in Busan. Subject 1, Cheryl. Subject 2, a child designated in the log only by age and physical description. Female, 4 years old, light build, dark hair. His daughter had a case number in someone else's surveillance file. Tak set the page down on the desk with a precision that was doing significant work. "They were watching her," he said. It was not a question, and CO did not treat it as one. Both of them, she said. The log entries run 6 days a week. School drop-offs, pickups, Cheryl's business hours, her regular routes, her contacts. There are notations on every adult who spent time in proximity to the child. Teachers, neighbors, a woman who ran the stall adjacent to Cheryl's alterations shop. She paused. Philomena is in there extensively from the 8-month mark onward. Her movements, her communications, her attempts to reach you. Every one of them is logged here before she made them. Before she made them. TAC absorbed the implication of that. The surveillance had not been reactive, watching Philomena after she began her attempts and trying to intercept. It had been predictive. Someone had anticipated Cheryl's decision to come forward and had put the infrastructure in place before the first letter was ever written. Which meant Mrs. Myers had a source close to Cheryl. Someone inside her life who had fed the decision back through a channel that ended at a private investigator's log in a file that was supposed to have been permanently removed from this building. He turned to the next page. "How many photos?" he said. CO placed a separate envelope on the desk. 143 confirmed. These are the ones in the backup. The originals, whatever the Pi's own archive contains, we don't have a number for yet. TAC opened the envelope. He went through them slowly. Cheryl outside the alterations shop, unlocking the door on a winter morning. Cheryl at a market, carrying bags, not looking at the camera because she didn't know the camera existed. A park, a public park with benches and a small climbing structure, and his daughter running between the bars of it with her arms out for balance, wearing a red coat, laughing at something outside the frame. He stopped at that photograph. She had his jaw. Philomena had said it, and it was true, the line of it, the particular angle. Everything else about her face was Cheryl's, softer and more open than anything in TAC's genetic inheritance had any right to produce. But the jaw was his, unmistakable, the same geometry he had looked at in mirrors for 38 years. She was laughing in the photograph. Someone outside the frame had made her laugh, and the camera had caught it from a distance, with a long lens, through a gap in the park's perimeter hedging. The composition of it, a child's private joy, captured without consent from behind a hedge, by a man being paid by a woman who had sat in the front row of a cathedral and performed maternal warmth, did something to the temperature behind TAC's eyes that he recognized as the specific cold that preceded decisions he did not reverse. He placed the photograph face down on the desk. He looked at CO. "The Pi, do we have identification?" "We have a partial. The log uses an internal reference code rather than a name, but the operational patterns, the locations used for observation, the documentation format, the notation style, are consistent with a firm that operates out of Buson's Eastern District. 3-person operation. They specialize in domestic and corporate surveillance for high-net-worth clients." She set a single sheet on the desk. "The firm's registered director is a man named Do Wansu. He has a prior working relationship with Mrs. Myers's family office. Confirmed 2 engagements in the last 7 years through financial records we accessed this morning." TAC looked at the name. "He still has the originals." "Almost certainly. And whatever he was instructed to do with them, if the engagement with Mrs. Myers concluded." CO nodded. "That's the concern." The concern, specifically, was this. A private investigator with a 14-month archive of photographs of his daughter, operating under instructions from a client whose situation had just destabilized catastrophically, was a variable that required immediate resolution. Men like Do Wansu didn't delete their archives out of professional courtesy. Archives were leverage. Archives were retirement funds. Archives were the thing you held onto precisely for the moment when the powerful people who commissioned you started having powerful problems. TAC closed the folder. "I will find them all," he said. The sentence was quiet and without theatrical weight, and was therefore, as CO understood from 6 years of proximity to this man, the most serious kind of sentence he produced. She made a note. "I want Do's location by noon," TAC said. "His office, his residence, and wherever he stores physical files. I want it confirmed, not estimated." He paused. "And I want to know the name of Mrs. Myers's source inside Cheryl's life. Someone was feeding her information in real time. That person is in Buson, and they are still in proximity to my daughter." CO left. Tack sat with a closed folder and the face-down photograph and the antique clock that read 6:31 and was about to chime. It chimed. The present dissolved, replaced by the memory of a sharper, hungrier time. He was 23. The neighborhood had a name, but most people who lived in it referred to it by the name of the intersection at its center, a shorthand that acknowledged the place without dignifying it. He had been running messages for a man named Goo who operated out of a basement printing shop, which is what the business was called when anyone official asked. Tack had understood early that the messages were not the point. The information in the messages was the point. He had started reading them, not because he intended to use the information, not at first, but because information was the only currency he could see a path to acquiring. His mother had a clock on the windowsill. She wound it every Sunday morning with the particular care of someone maintaining the last object of value in a life that had been progressively reduced. She died on a Tuesday. He had not been there. He had been 3 districts away, using information he'd accumulated over 8 months to dismantle a man who had been stealing from Goo, which had earned him a room and a salary and the beginning of a different kind of life. He had taken the clock. He had never decided what to do with it. He had simply kept it. His phone vibrated on the desk surface, pulling him back to 6:34 and the gray morning light and the folder. It was a message from the number Philomena had given him last night. 3 words: she slept well. He read it twice. Then he understood that she was talking about sorry, that Philomena had contacted Cheryl in Busan to confirm the child was undisturbed, that nothing from last night had reached their street yet, that his daughter had woken into an ordinary morning, without knowing that 7 hours north of her a man she'd never met had learned her name, and was systematically dismantling the infrastructure that had been built around her life without her knowledge or consent. He typed back, "Tell Cheryl no one approaches the child before I do. No one explains anything. Not yet." He sent it. Then he looked at the face-down photograph on his desk for a long moment before turning it back over. The red coat, the climbing bars, the laugh that had been captured by a long lens through a gap in a hedge. By 9 in the morning, 3 things had been confirmed. Do Wansu's office was in a converted ground-floor space on a commercial street in Busan's Sayong district. He operated under a business name that sounded like an accounting firm, which was intentional. His physical archive was stored in a locked room at the back of the office. This detail came from a former employee who was located by CO's team in under 2 hours through methods that did not require explanation. His digital archive was maintained on a local server, not cloud-based, which meant it was accessible only from the physical location. Do himself had been at his office as of 8:45 that morning, which one of CO's contacts in the area confirmed through the straightforward mechanism of walking past the front window. The second confirmation was the forged memo's origin. CO's team had identified a graphic designer, freelance, untraceable at the surface level, but traceable 1 layer down, who had produced letterhead forgeries for 3 clients in the past 2 years. One of those clients had paid through a shell account that connected, through 2 intermediary layers, to a holding company registered to Mrs. Myers's family office. The third confirmation arrived at 9:17 and was the one that changed the temperature of the room. CO placed a single sheet on the desk without preamble. "The source inside Cheryl's life," she said. Tack looked at the sheet. It was a financial record, small transfers, regular, spanning 14 months. The recipient account was registered to a woman named Gong Ai. His team had identified her as Cheryl's neighbor in the building adjacent to the alterations shop. She had lived there for 16 months, 2 months before the surveillance began. She had been placed there, moved into position before the operation started. Tack set the sheet down. "She's still in Busan," CO said. "Same address as of this morning." Which meant Gong Ai was still living next to Cheryl, still in proximity to his daughter, still, potentially, reporting. The client relationship might have been disrupted by last night's events, but disruption and termination were different things, and until the financial thread was formally severed, the woman next door was an unresolved variable in a situation that could not afford unresolved variables. Tack stood. He picked up the photograph of the red coat and the climbing bars and put it in his interior jacket pocket alongside the DNA test, pressing both flat against his chest. I'll go to Busan myself, he said. CO looked at him. That's a significant exposure. Your rivals are already. I know what my rivals are doing, he said. They'll do it whether I'm here or in Busan. The difference is that in Busan there is a 4-year-old girl whose neighbor is on someone's payroll, and I am not going to delegate that particular problem. CO nodded once and moved to coordinate. Tak looked at the folder on his desk, at the thickness of it, at the 14 months of documented watching, the school, the park, the market, the red coat, assembled into a record by a man being paid by a woman who had decided, with the comprehensive arrogance of someone who had never been genuinely afraid of consequences, that she could build a wall between a man and his blood and maintain it indefinitely. How many photos? I will find them all. 143 confirmed. An unknown number in an office in Sayong district that Tak was going to be standing in before nightfall. And one woman in a steel gray suit, currently being held in a comfortable room 2 floors below this office, who had not yet been told that her PI's backup files had survived her careful removal of the originals. That conversation was no longer tomorrow's problem. It was this afternoon's. Right after Tak looked his daughter's neighbor in the eye and asked her, in the quiet voice he used when the answer was not negotiable, exactly what she had been paid to watch and exactly who she had told. Busan arrived the way cities do when you've spent years avoiding them, all at once, through a car window, familiar in its geography and foreign in everything else. Tak had been to Busan 14 times on syndicate business. He knew its port infrastructure, its commercial districts, the 3 restaurants where conversations of a specific nature could be conducted without ambient surveillance concerns. He had never had cause to know its residential streets. The narrower ones, with the laundry lines between buildings and the small grocery stalls, and the neighbors who learned each other's schedules through proximity rather than intention. The car moved through the Sayong district first. They stopped outside Do Wansu's office at 2:11 in the afternoon. The meeting with the private investigator was brief and technical, and conducted in the back room where the physical archive was stored. And by 2:43 the archive, all of it, the originals and the copies and the external drives, was in a case in the trunk of Tak's car, and Do Wansu had been given a comprehensive explanation of what his professional future would look like if any shadow copy of any image surfaced anywhere through any channel at any point in the remainder of his career. Do had understood. Men in his profession developed a finely calibrated instinct for which clients they could eventually leverage, and which clients represented a category of risk that made leverage a suicidal option. He had miscategorized Mrs. Myers's commission. He would not make an equivalent error again. From Sayong, they drove 15 minutes east to the street, where Cheryl's alterations shop occupied the ground floor of a narrow building with a blue awning and a hand-lettered sign. Gong Airai, the neighbor, was located and managed by 2 of CO's Busan contacts with the quiet efficiency that Tak's organization had spent years developing. The financial thread was severed. The woman's understanding of her situation's new parameters was made explicit. She would be relocating within the week. This took 40 minutes. By 4:15, the logistical problems that had existed that morning no longer existed in their original form. The archive was secured. The surveillance infrastructure was dismantled. The immediate variables around his daughter's daily life had been resolved with the same methodical precision Tak applied to every operational problem. He sat in the parked car outside a small public park 3 streets from Cheryl's building and understood that the next problem was not logistical. Philomena was waiting on a bench inside. She had arrived from Seoul on an earlier train, had spent 2 hours with Cheryl in the apartment above the shop, and had texted Tak at 3:50 with the park's address and a single additional line. Cheryl agreed. She'll bring Sari at 4:30. She asked me to tell you she's terrified. He had read that last sentence 4 times on the drive over. He was sitting in the car at 4:22 and had not moved. Choi, in the passenger seat, said nothing. Since their conversation in the office last night, Choi had operated in a register of careful, undemonstrative usefulness, present, functional, asking nothing and offering nothing beyond what was requested. The accounting between them was pending, and both men knew it. For now, Choi's role was proximity, and he was fulfilling it without requiring management. Does she know? Tak said, not to Choi specifically, to the windshield. Choi understood the question. Philomena said Cheryl told her there's a man who knew her father who wants to say hello. That's all. A man who knew her father. Tak registered the architecture of that sentence. The careful, protective fiction constructed to give a 4-year-old child a frame for an incomprehensible situation. Her father was not an abstraction to sorry. Her father was a gap. A subject Cheryl had presumably navigated around for 4 years with the resourcefulness of someone who understood that some gaps, if described too precisely too early, become the shape a child grows around rather than through. He got out of the car. The park was small, the kind of neighborhood park that exists not as a destination, but as a default, a patch of maintained space between buildings where the immediate community deposits its daily life. A climbing structure in the center, 4 benches, a path that circled the perimeter, 2 older women on one bench, talking without looking at each other, a man walking a dog along the path. Afternoon light coming in low from the west, the particular gold of late winter sun that flatters everything indiscriminately. Philomena stood when she saw him approach and met him at the park's entrance. Cheryl is 5 minutes out, she said. She walks sorry through the back street from the school pickup. They'll come in through the east gate. Tak looked at the park, at the climbing structure, at the bench closest to the east gate, which was the obvious place to position himself, and which he immediately identified as wrong, too direct, too formal, a man sitting and waiting like an appointment. He looked at the path. I'll walk, he said. When they come in, don't signal me. Let it happen at whatever pace it happens. Philomena studied him for a moment with the assessing quality he had noticed in the cathedral, the look of someone accustomed to reading situations that most people couldn't read. She nodded and returned to her bench. Tak walked the perimeter path, hands in his coat pockets. The coat was plain. He had told Choi before leaving Seoul to source something without the specific cut and fabric weight that his usual clothing carried, the visual signals of a particular kind of power that were invisible to adults who'd grown accustomed to filtering them and entirely legible to children who hadn't yet learned to ignore what they saw. He had thought about this specifically, on the drive down, the way children read things. He was thinking about it now, moving along the path, and understanding with uncomfortable clarity that there were things he could not change about his appearance regardless of the coat. The tattoos on his neck were visible above the collar. The particular quality of his stillness, the way he occupied space without excess movement, the way his eyes tracked the environment with the automatic vigilance of someone who had spent years in rooms where the location of exits was a professional necessity. These were not things a different coat resolved. He had, for the first time in a very long time, no available strategy. The east gate opened. He didn't look directly. He saw it in his peripheral vision, a woman, slight in a gray coat, and beside her a child in a yellow jacket holding her hand, taking the particular skipping half steps of a small person who has been walking since school and has opinions about the pace. Tak kept walking. His path would bring him around to the east side in approximately 90 seconds. He used those 90 seconds to do something he had no established method for. He tried to make himself smaller, not physically, the quality of his presence. The thing that preceded him into rooms. He breathed differently. He looked at the ground for several steps, which was not something he did, which was precisely why he was doing it now. He came around the eastern curve of the path. Cheryl saw him first. He knew because her gait changed, not breaking stride, but absorbing something, a micro-adjustment of the kind that confirmed she had been bracing for this moment and was now executing her way through it. She was lean and careful-looking, with the face of someone who had made a great number of decisions alone and had stopped apologizing for any of them. She looked at him with an expression that contained no warmth and no hostility, only the specific, exhausted honesty of a woman who has spent 4 years managing something very heavy and has just agreed to set it down in front of the person it belonged to. He looked at Sari. She was looking at the climbing structure. She was smaller than he'd calibrated from the photographs. The yellow jacket had a small embroidered bear on the left shoulder. Her hair was in 2 uneven knots that suggested she had opinions about the hairstyling process. She was missing one of her front teeth, a gap he hadn't been able to see in any of the surveillance photographs, which had all been taken at distance, and which now struck him with a force entirely disproportionate to its size. She had his jaw, and she had Cheryl's eyes, fully open to everything around her, taking in the park with the comprehensive interest of someone for whom a Tuesday afternoon park still contains infinite data worth examining. She noticed him because he was on the path, and she was walking toward the path, and he was simply there. She looked at him the way children look at adults, direct and without social filter, the gaze of someone who hasn't yet learned that sustained eye contact with strangers carries implications. She looked at his neck, at the tattoos. Her eyes went wide, not with fear exactly, with the arrested attention of a child who has encountered something that doesn't fit any existing category. Her steps slowed. Her grip on Cheryl's hand tightened. She moved just slightly, barely perceptibly, behind Cheryl's leg. Tak stopped walking. "I'm just a stranger," he said. He said it quietly, and he directed it at the space between himself and Cheryl, not at the child, not a performance of friendliness that a child would immediately identify as constructed. Just a fact, stated plainly. She doesn't have to say anything. Cheryl looked at him. In her eyes was something he hadn't expected, not accusation, not relief, but a kind of grief that he recognized because he had been carrying its mirror version for the 21 hours since the cathedral. The grief of someone who had made the best decision available to them with the information they had, and was now standing inside the consequences of it. "Sorry," Cheryl said, looking down. "This is Mr. Tak. He's going to walk with us for a bit." Sorry looked at him from behind the leg, at the tattoos again, then at his face. "Why do you have drawings on your neck?" she asked. The question arrived with the complete, unself-conscious directness of a 4-year-old for whom the social contract around not asking things had not yet been installed. Behind him, at the bench, he was aware of Philomena going very still. Tak crouched down. Not all the way, he was still tall, still large. The geometry of him didn't resolve into something unthreatening simply by reducing the angle. But he brought himself closer to her level, and he looked at her directly and said, "I got them a long time ago, when I was young and thought they were a good idea." Sorry considered this with the gravity of a small person weighing new information. "My friend Dion has a sticker tattoo," she said. "It came off in the bath." "Mine didn't," Tak said. She almost smiled. Almost the corner of her mouth moved, and then she reconsidered it and looked at the climbing structure instead, with the tactical redirection of a child who has decided she is not ready to commit to friendliness yet. "I have to get this right." The thought moved through him with a clarity that bypassed every professional instinct he possessed. Not the cold, calculating right of a man managing outcomes. Something else entirely. Something that had no language in any room he had ever operated in. He stood back up. He did not push. He fell into step beside Cheryl at a distance that communicated availability rather than proximity. And the three of them, 4, with the ghost of everything that had happened, moved along the path at Sorry's pace, which was determined entirely by what was interesting on the ground. Cheryl said, low enough that only he could hear, "She doesn't know. She thinks her father lives very far away and is very busy. I never said he was bad. I want you to know that." Tak looked at her, the care in that sentence, the specific. Intentional care of a woman who had protected a child from a complicated truth without poisoning the absence, registered somewhere below his sternum. "Thank you," he said. Cheryl nodded. She looked at the path ahead. "You have to understand she's not going to just," she stopped, found different words. "She's 4. She doesn't know what you are to her. You're just a tall man with ink on his neck who scared her for 10 seconds. "I know," he said. "Good," she paused. "Because the next part is harder than tonight. Tonight is just walking." Sorry had reached the climbing structure. She grabbed the first bar and hauled herself up with the focused determination of someone who has done this many times and has a preferred route. She climbed to the top platform and stood up and looked out over the park with the proprietorial satisfaction of a small person who has conquered a significant elevation. Then she looked down at Tak. From up there, with the late gold light behind her, and the gap in her teeth, and the 2 uneven knots, and the yellow jacket with the bear on the shoulder, she studied him for a long moment with the full, unfiltered assessment of a child who had not yet learned to pretend she wasn't looking. "Are you scared of high places?" she called down. He looked up at her. "No," he said. "Good," she said, "because you're very big, and if you fell it would be very loud." And then she turned and climbed down the other side, already moving toward the next interesting thing, already finished with him for now. Tak stood at the base of the climbing structure with his hands in his coat pockets and watched her go. Was the power worth the price of the life you almost missed? He had no answer for that yet. He was only beginning to understand the size of the question. Behind him, on the bench, Philomena was watching. And somewhere in Seoul, in a comfortable room 2 floors below his empty office, a woman in steel gray silk was waiting for a conversation that was coming whether she had prepared for it or not. But that was later. Right now there was a yellow jacket moving through a park in the late afternoon light, and a man standing very still, watching it go, learning for the first time what it felt like to be in a room, or a park, or a life, and have no strategy at all. The room they had kept Veronica in was not a cell. Tak had been specific about that. A cell would have communicated anger, and anger was a readable position. It told the person on the receiving end that they had penetrated your defenses, that what they did mattered enough to wound you. The room was instead a well-appointed guest suite on the 14th floor of a building his organization maintained for extended operational purposes. Good furniture. A window with a view of the Han River. A bathroom with actual towels. Food had been brought at regular intervals and either eaten or not, according to Veronica's preference. She had eaten. He noted this when Seo briefed him on the drive back from Busan. A woman who maintained her appetite under these conditions was a woman who was managing herself deliberately, conserving resources, preparing. He had expected nothing less. He arrived at the building at 9:40 in the evening. He had not called ahead. The door opened from the outside, and Veronica was seated at the small table near the window, facing the river, in the clothes she had been brought from her apartment, something dark and structured, nothing like the ivory lace, a choice that communicated clearly that she too understood the difference between the performance of yesterday and the reality of today. She turned when he entered. She did not stand. Tak sat across from her. He had brought nothing, no folder, no documentation, no physical evidence to place on the table between them. Everything he needed was already in his possession. This conversation was not about evidence. He looked at her for a moment in the way he had looked at her at the altar, reading the temperature behind the composure, finding the seam. "You've been thinking about what to say," he said. "For 30 hours, she said. "Yes." "Then say it." Veronica looked at the river. The lights of the city reflected off the water in long, broken columns. She was quiet for a moment, not the performing quiet of someone constructing an impression, but the genuine quiet of someone who has rehearsed something so many times it has stopped feeling rehearsed and started feeling true. "I did it for us," she said. The sentence arrived without theatrical weight, which made it more effective than it would have been with any. She had learned that from someone, possibly from her mother, possibly from years of watching rooms and understanding how sincerity was perceived versus how it was performed. Tak said nothing. "I know how that sounds," she continued. "I know what you found in that office. I know you've spent 30 hours dismantling everything, and I know what the architecture of it looks like from the outside. It looks like a conspiracy. It looks calculated and cold and entirely about control." She looked at him now, directly. "But I need you to understand what it looked like from where I was standing when it started." "Tell me," he said. She took a breath. 8 months before our engagement, my mother came to me. She had information. She'd commissioned information, which I didn't know yet, which I found out later, and which I should have asked more questions about at the time. She told me there was a woman in Busan with a child who was about to contact you. She told me that if that contact reached you, everything we had built toward would be finished before it began. That you would pivot entirely, that a child would become your singular focus, and the alliance, the political leverage, the syndicate stability we were building toward would collapse. She paused. She said it was a threat to the organization. She framed it as an operational concern. "And you believed her," Tak said. "I believed her framing," Veronica said. "There's a difference. I didn't believe the child was a fabrication. I knew from the way my mother presented it that the child was real. But I told myself that the timing of the disclosure, right before the engagement, structured to disrupt, was being orchestrated for maximum impact. A beat. I told myself someone was using an innocent child as a tactical instrument. Someone was, Tack said, your mother. The sentence landed. Veronica absorbed it without visible reaction, which was its own kind of reaction. I know that now, she said. I have known it in the part of myself I've been refusing to consult for longer than I'd like to admit. Before we go further, if you've ever watched someone you trusted reframe their own actions until the wrongdoing disappeared, you've witnessed something psychologists call cognitive distortion, the mind's ability to reconstruct a harmful choice as a justified one. It's not unique to villains in stories. It happens in boardrooms, in families, in relationships, every day. The most dangerous version is when the person doing it has genuinely convinced themselves. Stay with this. It matters to how the rest of this unfolds. Tack looked at her. At the specific quality of her honesty right now, which was real, he assessed, at least partially. Veronica Myers was not a simple liar. Simple liars were easy. She was something more architecturally complex. A person who had arranged the available truths into a structure that justified her, and had lived inside that structure long enough to mistake it for the foundation. You said you did it for us, he said. Define us. She looked at him steadily. For what I believed we could become, for an arrangement that I had invested in emotionally, strategically, personally, in ways that I don't think you ever fully registered. She stopped. Let that sit. Then, you were never really with me, Tack. You were present. You were attentive in the ways your protocols required attentiveness, but you were never actually there. And I told myself that the child, if she entered your life, would be the thing that confirmed it. That you would disappear into that, and what little of you existed in our direction would be permanently redirected. Tack said nothing for a long moment. Outside, the river held its broken columns of light. She was not wrong. He turned this over with the same honesty he was demanding from her. He had chosen Veronica with the same analytical framework he applied to acquisitions. He had been present in exactly the ways she described, calibrated, correct, sufficient. He had given her the performance of partnership without its substance, and she had known, and had said nothing, and had built her own strategy around the gap. That's true, he said. She blinked. She had not expected agreement. I treated the engagement as a transaction, he said. I treated you as a variable I had optimized for. What you felt in the space that left is not something I can argue with. He leaned forward slightly. But I need you to hear the next part clearly. What you just described, the loneliness of that, the frustration, the sense of being held at the exact right distance, none of it authorized what you did. You do not compensate for emotional absence by erasing a child's father. Those are not equivalent injuries. Veronica looked at the table surface. Something moved through her expression, not the controlled grief of the cathedral, not the strategic composure of the past 30 hours. Something more unguarded. The face of a woman who had believed, at some level, that if she could just get to this conversation, if she could just explain the inside of it clearly enough, the accounting would be different. I know, she said quietly. I know they're not equivalent. Then tell me, Tack said. At what point during the 8 months did it stop being your mother's operation and become yours? The silence that followed was the most honest thing she had produced since he entered the room. The third letter, she said finally, Philomena's lawyer, when Rian showed me the response he drafted. She looked up. I read it, I knew what it was closing off, and I approved it. A breath. Not because I still believed the operational framing. By then I knew what I was doing. I approved it because I was, she stopped, found the word. Afraid. Of the child, Tack said. Of losing the version of you I'd constructed, she said. Of losing the strategic position, of losing, she stopped again. This time the pause was different, longer. She looked at the river. Of being exactly what I was afraid I was, replaceable. Love isn't a strategy, Tack said. He said it without harshness, as a plain statement. As something he was only fully understanding himself, in real time, in a room overlooking a river, 2 days after a wedding that hadn't happened, and 1 day after standing at the base of a climbing structure, watching a yellow jacket move through afternoon light. I know that now, he said. I should have known it before. I built an engagement on the same framework you're describing, calculated, optimized, transactional. And I thought that was sufficient. I thought that was a stable structure. He looked at her directly. It wasn't, and the reason it wasn't had nothing to do with a child in Busan. It had everything to do with the fact that I treated a human being like a line item and expected the relationship to hold. Veronica looked at him. In her expression was something he hadn't seen from her before, not admiration, not manipulation, not the careful warmth of a woman performing emotional availability. Something rawer. The look of a person who came into a room expecting a verdict and received instead a mirror. That doesn't change what I did, she said. No, he said, it doesn't. What happens now? She asked. Tak sat back. He looked at the river for a moment, at the broken light on the water. Your mother, he said, is a separate conversation with a separate set of consequences. The surveillance operation, the forged documentation, the compromising of my staff, those are not things that resolve with an explanation. He paused. Your role in the approval of the third interception is something my legal team will address formally. That process will be what it will be. Veronica nodded. She had known this. She had been sitting with it for 30 hours. And us, she said, not hopefully, just completing the inventory. There is no us, Tak said. There wasn't one before which we've just established. There is certainly not one now. He said it without cruelty. It was simply the accurate statement of a condition that had been true longer than either of them had acknowledged. What there is, going forward, is a set of legal arrangements and a mutual interest in handling them without escalation. Beyond that, he stood. I think you already know. Veronica looked at him as he moved toward the door. Tak. He stopped but didn't turn. The little girl, she said. Is she stopped, reconsidered, started differently. I hope she's well. I want you to know that the child herself was I never thought of her as. I know, he said, and he did know, which was the complicated part. Veronica's architecture had been built around fear and strategy and a loneliness he had partly created. The child had been collateral to all of that, not a target. It didn't reduce the consequence, but he knew. He opened the door. Goodbye, Veronica, he said. She said nothing. She turned back to the river. In the corridor, Tak stood for a moment outside the closed door. The accounting of that room, what he had said, what she had said, what was true in both directions, settled into him with the weight of something that would require time to fully process. He was not given to self-examination as a practice. He was beginning to understand that this had been its own kind of damage. His phone showed a message from Philomena, sent 40 minutes ago. Sorry asked Cheryl tonight if the man with the drawings on his neck was coming back to the park. He read it twice. Then, for the first time in 30 hours, something in his chest loosened by a fraction, not relief, not happiness exactly. Something quieter than either. The specific sensation of a door that has been locked for a very long time moving, just slightly on its hinge. He typed back, tell her yes. Down the corridor, in a separate room, a woman in steel gray silk was still waiting for her own conversation. They think I'm weak. Let them come. Watch how I handle this. That was tomorrow. Tonight, Tak walked to the elevator with his phone in his hand and the message still on the screen. And for the first time since the cathedral, he was not calculating the next move. He was just a man in a corridor, thinking about a park and a yellow jacket and a question about whether he was scared of high places. The message arrived at 5:47 in the morning. Not a call. A message, which was itself the communication, in the specific grammar of the underworld Tak had spent 15 years navigating. A call meant urgency, a visit meant respect, and a message meant contempt. Someone had calculated that Tak Suk-chin was now the kind of man you sent messages to rather than the kind you called. The sender was a number registered to the operational office of a man named Baek Sung-yi. Baek controlled the Western Port Logistics Network, the legitimate surface of it, and the infrastructure underneath. He was 61 years old, methodical, and had been waiting for 17 years for a window in tax position that was wide enough to move through. He had the patience of a man who understood that opportunity, in this industry, was not created. It was waited for. The message read, heard the wedding was called off. Unfortunate timing with the Incheon renewal coming up. We should talk about the transition. Tak read it once, set the phone face down on the desk, picked up his coffee. The Incheon renewal was a territorial agreement covering the Northern Logistics Corridor, 3 years of negotiated stability, that had been built on the understood premise of tax syndicate structural solidity. Beek was not suggesting a conversation about the renewal. He was suggesting, in the specific coded language of men who never said what they meant directly, that he considered the structural solidity to be in question. By 6:15, 2 more messages had arrived from separate numbers. The first was oblique, a request to revisit the terms of a distribution arrangement in the Southern Corridor from an organization that had not requested a revisit in 4 years. The second was less oblique, a single line from a number TAC recognized as belonging to the logistics coordinator of a rival network operating out of Incheon itself. Heard you had some family complications. The corridor waits for no one. They think I'm weak. TAC picked up his phone and called Seo. She answered on the first ring, which meant she had been awake. I've seen them, she said before he spoke. All 3. 4, there's a 4th from the Giala network that came in at 6:08. Lower tier, but the timing is coordinated. These aren't independent opportunists reading the same news. Someone circulated a signal. TAC set his coffee down. Beek. Most likely the origin point. He has the reach and the motive. The others are secondaries. They wouldn't move on their own, but they'll move if Beek moves first and the position holds. This was the standard mechanics of it. In an ecosystem built on the projection of strength, the appearance of vulnerability was its own kind of wound, not because it invited one decisive challenger, but because it invited a cascade. The first serious probe, if unanswered correctly, became permission for the next. The wedding had been public. 500 witnesses to a syndicate boss caught off guard at his own altar. A DNA test delivered by a waitress. A wedding called off in front of the entire political and business establishment of the city. The narrative had spread in the hours, since with the velocity of information that powerful people find both scandalous and useful. I want a full briefing at 8, TAC said. My office, Choi Yu, the Incheon liaison, and the legal team. He paused. Not the full table, just those. Understood. A beat. The Incheon renewal meeting is in 9 days. I know when the meeting is. He ended the call. He stood at the eastern window and looked at the city grid below in the early morning light and ran the calculation with the part of his mind that had never, regardless of what else was occurring, stopped being operational. The position was not as weak as Beek believed. This was the miscalculation that ambitious men consistently made. They read the visible disruption and assumed it penetrated the infrastructure. A wedding interrupted was not an organization destabilized. The finances were intact. The territorial agreements were intact. The staff, with the specific exceptions currently being processed, were intact. What had been disrupted was the perception of control, which was a different problem than the loss of it. And perception, unlike infrastructure, could be corrected quickly if you moved correctly. The question was what correctly looked like in this specific situation. The briefing at 8 lasted 40 minutes. TAC spoke for the first 12. He laid out the incoming probes, their likely coordination, Beek's probable endgame, and the 9-day window before the Incheon renewal. He did this without notes, in the same register he used for everything, flat, precise, no editorial. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Choi spoke first. Beek's move on the Incheon corridor depends on the renewal meeting going badly. If we walk in their solid, unified front, no visible fractures, his position collapses before he's committed anything actionable. He knows that, TAC said, which means his next move is to ensure the meeting doesn't go well. He'll apply pressure between now and then. On the corridor partners, on the subsidiary networks, possibly on staff. Our staff, the Incheon liaison asked. He'll look for anyone whose loyalty he thinks the last 2 days might have loosened. TAC looked around the table. Which means everyone in this room needs to be visible and functional in the next 72 hours. No absences, no delayed responses, no behavior that reads as internal disorder. He paused on Choi briefly. A fraction of a second. Choi held it without deflecting. We present continuity, absolute and unambiguous. The legal team lead, a precise woman named Attorney Wu who had managed TAC's organizational documentation for 8 years, set a folder on the table. There's a secondary issue. 3 of the corridor partners have received what appear to be anonymous briefings about the DNA situation. Detailed ones. Details that didn't come from any public source. Tak looked at the folder. Beek has a source inside the cathedral guest list. Or inside our legal processing of the situation, Wu said carefully. The information in the briefings includes details about the administrative interception, the letters, the pie, the internal staff involvement. That level of detail suggests access to the documentation we've been compiling. The room recalibrated. Tak let the recalibration happen then. Lock the documentation, physical copies only, held by Wu's office. Digital access suspended as of this meeting. Anyone outside this room who requests information about the internal situation goes through me directly. He looked at Wu. The corridor partners who receive the briefings, I'll contact them personally. Today. That's significant exposure, Seo said. It's also the only move that works, Tak said. Beek's entire strategy depends on the partners believing I'm managing a crisis. The moment I call them directly, calmly, with full command of the facts and zero indication of disorder, the briefing he sent them becomes noise. He paused. I know these men. They didn't build what they built by backing unstable positions. They'll read the call correctly. Let them come. He made the calls from his office between 9 and 11:30. 6 corridor partners. 6 conversations, each calibrated to the specific history and concern of the man on the other end. He did not over-explain. He did not reference the wedding directly unless the partner did, and when they did, he acknowledged it with the measured brevity of a man describing a personnel matter that has been handled, not a catastrophe, not a scandal, a matter. Something identified, assessed, resolved. By the third call, he could hear the shift. The careful, non-committal language of men deciding which way the wind was blowing beginning to resolve into something more solid. By the 6th, the corridor was stable. Not enthusiastic, stability was not enthusiasm, but holding. He set the phone down at 11:47 and looked at the antique clock on his desk. Then he looked at the folder Seo had placed on the corner of the desk, before leaving, the compiled intelligence on Beek's current operational posture. Financial positions, territorial commitments, the leverage points in his network that a sufficiently informed adversary could apply pressure to without direct confrontation. Tak had built his career on a principle that most people in his industry misunderstood. The most effective response to aggression was not always counter-aggression. Sometimes it was architecture. You didn't fight the man coming through the door. You redesigned the building so the door no longer led where he expected. Watch how I handle this. He opened the folder and began to read. At 2 in the afternoon, Choi knocked and entered without waiting. Which was the protocol for information that required immediate delivery? Beek made a move, Choi said. He contacted the Incheon Renewal Committee directly and requested an agenda amendment. He wants to add a structural review item, essentially a formal assessment of whether the current territorial arrangements remain viable given recent organizational developments. Tak looked up from the folder. The committee accepted the amendment. They're considering it. The chair wants to hear from you before deciding. Tak nodded once. Get me the chair. The call with the committee chair lasted 8 minutes. When it ended, the agenda amendment had been declined, not because Tak had applied pressure, but because he had provided the chair with a sufficiently clear picture of what the amendment's acceptance would signal to every other network watching the renewal process. And the chair, who had been managing these arrangements for 11 years, understood that signal clearly and had no interest in sending it. Beek's move had been blocked before it formalized. Choi stood at the window. He won't stop at the committee. No, Tak agreed. He'll escalate, which is what I want. Choi turned. You want him to escalate? I want him committed, Tak said. Right now he's probing, testing, retreating, probing again. Men who are probing are dangerous because they're patient. Men who are committed have made a position visible enough to address. He closed the folder. Every move he makes in the next 9 days extends his exposure. By the time we walk into the Incheon renewal, I want him overextended. Choi was quiet for a moment. Then, and the internal situation, the staff compromises, the documentation leak. Being addressed through the appropriate channels. Tak looked at him directly, including yours. The accounting between them had been pending since the office conversation 2 nights ago. Choi met the directness without flinching. I understand. I know you do, Tak said. That's why you're still in this room. It was the closest thing to absolution Tak was currently capable of offering, and both of them understood its precise boundaries. Choi nodded. There's one more thing. He placed a printed photograph on the desk. This was posted to 3 anonymous channels this morning. It's circulating in the secondary networks. Tak looked at the photograph. It was from Do Wansu's archive. One he hadn't seen, taken not in the park or outside the alterations shop, but through a window. Cheryl at a kitchen table, and beside her, barely in frame, the edge of a small chair and a child's arm in a yellow sleeve. Tak looked at it for a long moment. His voice, when he spoke, was very quiet. Beek has a copy of the archive. It appears so, Choi said. Either directly from Do, before you secured the files, or through the source inside the building who leaked the documentation details. The calculations shifted. This was no longer a territorial dispute navigated through protocol and corridor politics. A photograph of his daughter, even a partial one, even anonymous, circulated through criminal networks was a message of a specific and unambiguous kind. It was not a negotiating position. It was a declaration. Tak stood up. They think I'm weak. Let them come. Watch how I handle this. He looked at the photograph once more. Then he picked it up, folded it, and put it in his jacket pocket alongside the DNA test and the park photograph. The red coat, the climbing bars, the gap-toothed laugh. Get CEO, he said, and find out how Beek got that file. Choi moved toward the door. Choi, he stopped. The girl doesn't leave Cheryl's sight. 24 hours, are people not contractors, people I have looked in the eye. Done, Choi said. He left. Tak stood at the eastern window with his hand pressed flat against his jacket pocket over the 3 folded pieces of paper inside it, and looked at the city grid below, the infrastructure of a place he had spent 15 years learning to control, and understood that the game Beek was playing had just changed its nature entirely. This was no longer about the Inchin corridor. This was about a yellow jacket in a park, and the specific, catastrophic error of using it as leverage against the man who owned it. A confrontation was coming that would not be resolved through committee procedures or corridor politics, or the careful, architectural patience of a man redesigning buildings. And somewhere in the steel-gray silk, a woman who had not yet answered for her role in building the infrastructure that made this possible was still waiting. Her wait, Tak decided, was over. Her name was Myung Yongsuk. Not Mrs. Myers, which was the name she had acquired through her late husband and deployed with the specific authority of a woman who understood that borrowed power, if worn long enough and confidently enough, became indistinguishable from the original. Not Veronica's mother, which reduced her to a relational role she had always considered beneath the actual architecture of who she was. Myung Yongsuk, 63 years old. The daughter of a provincial magistrate who had taught her, by example rather than instruction, that the distance between influence and control was simply the willingness to do what others considered excessive. She had been waiting in the 14th floor suite for 41 hours when Tak walked through the door at 3:20 in the afternoon. She was seated at the table near the window, precisely where Veronica had sat 2 days prior, though the quality of her occupying the space was entirely different. Veronica had sat with the tension of someone bracing for impact. Myung Yongsuk sat with the practiced ease of a woman who had decided, somewhere in the previous 41 hours, that her best remaining asset was the appearance of someone who had nothing to be afraid of. She had dressed carefully. The steel-gray silk had been replaced. Someone had brought her things from her apartment with something darker, more severe. She wore no jewelry except small pearl earrings that Tak recognized from the cathedral photographs in Doe's file as the same ones she had worn to the wedding. A detail. A statement of continuity. She was communicating that she remained, despite everything, the same woman. Tak sat across from her. He placed nothing on the table. He looked at her in silence for a full 10 seconds, not as a tactic, or not only as a tactic. He was completing a reading he had begun in the cathedral when she rose from the front pew and he had told her to sit down, and she had. He had been managing the immediate situation then. He had the full picture now. Myung Yongsuk, he said, her actual name, not the social title. She received this without visible reaction, which confirmed she had been expecting it. Tak Suk-shin, she replied, equally direct, the grammar of two people who have decided to dispense with the performance layer. You know why you're here, he said. I know what you believe you know, she said. There's a distinction. There isn't, he said, but we'll get there. He reached into his jacket and placed 3 items on the table in a specific sequence. First, a printed page from Do Wan-su's log, a dated entry from 11 months prior, with her family office's reference code in the commission field. Second, a copy of the forged legal memo with the graphic designer's authentication trail attached. Third, the financial record showing 14 months of payments to Gong A. Rai, the neighbor who had been moved into position beside Cheryl's building 2 months before the surveillance commenced. He placed them in a row and left them there and looked at her. She looked at the documents. Her eyes moved across them with the controlled attention of a woman reading a contract, looking for the clause that changes the terms, the ambiguity that creates leverage, the gap between what is documented and what can be proven in a room that matters. She didn't find it. He had ensured there was nothing to find. You stalked my blood, he said. The sentence arrived in the room with a quality that was different from anything preceding it. Not louder, not more aggressive. Different in the way that a change in temperature is different from a change in sound, registered by a different part of the nervous system entirely. Mayung Yongsuk looked up from the documents. For the first time since he entered the room, something moved behind her composed expression. Not guilt. Guilt required a moral framework that acknowledged wrongdoing, and she had not yet arrived there. Something more primitive, the recognition of a miscalculation. I protected an asset, she said. Your organization, the alliance, the leverage structure that the marriage was designed to. Stop, Tak said. She stopped. I'm going to tell you what you did, he said. Not what you've decided it was, what it was. He leaned forward, forearms on the table, and looked at her with the flat, focused attention he reserved for situations where he needed the other person to understand that every word he was about to say was the last word on the subject. You hired a private investigator to conduct 14 months of physical surveillance on a woman and a child in Busan. You placed an informant in the building adjacent to their home. You intercepted communications directed to me, not to your organization, not to a corporate entity, to me personally, using forged documentation to compromise 2 members of my staff into executing an interception protocol they believed was sanctioned. He paused. You watched my daughter walk to school 6 days a week for over a year. You have photographs of her taken through a kitchen window. Another pause, shorter. You then allowed those photographs to be leaked into criminal networks as leverage against my territorial position. Mayung Yongsuk's jaw tightened. The leak was not authorized by you, Tak said. I know. It was Beak. He accessed the archive before I secured it, through a channel that traces back to the graphic designer you used for the memo forgery, a man who, it turns out, has working relationships with 3 separate networks, one of which reports to Beak. He looked at her steadily. Which means the infrastructure you built to manage my personal situation became the infrastructure through which a rival used my daughter as a negotiating instrument. That is the consequence of your architecture. Here is something worth understanding, and it applies far beyond this story. When we build systems of control around other people's lives, we rarely account for who else gains access to those systems. Privacy violations are never contained to their original purpose. Every surveillance apparatus, every intercepted communication, every compromised informant creates a structure that others can enter through doors we didn't know we'd left open. The damage rarely stops with the person who built it. The room was quiet. Outside, the Han River caught the afternoon light and held it indifferently. Mayung Yongsuk looked at the documents on the table. The precision with which Tak had laid them, the sequencing, the completeness, the absence of any gap she could insert a different narrative into, was communicating something that 41 hours of preparation had not fully prepared her for. She had expected anger. She had prepared for anger, which was manageable, which could be navigated around. She had prepared for negotiation, which was her native terrain. She had not prepared for this, for a man who had done his homework so completely that the conversation she'd rehearsed had no surface to grip. What do you want? She said. The directness of someone who has decided that the performance of innocence is no longer cost-effective. I want you to understand what you're looking at, Tak said. before we discuss anything else. I understand what I'm looking at. No, he said. You're looking at it as a legal problem, a documentation problem, a matter of what can be proven in which room to which authority. He shook his head, a minimal movement. That's not what this is. She looked at him. I own your future now, he said, not as a threat, as a description of a condition that already exists. He gestured at the documents. The forged legal documentation alone carries criminal exposure for fraud and impersonation. The surveillance operation, conducted without authorization on a minor, carries additional exposure that your lawyers will explain to you in detail. The financial records connecting your family office to the informant placement are clean, complete, and in the possession of my legal team as of this morning. He paused. Added to this, I have the record of 14 months of access your operation maintained to my internal communications, which constitutes a separate category of liability under 3 separate statutes that Attorney Wu has already enumerated. Mayang Yongsuk's hands, folded on the table, had gone very still. Your family office, Tak continued, holds 11 active investment positions that depend on relationships with entities whose confidence in you is contingent on your legal and operational integrity. Your social standing, the rooms you access, the names you deploy, the currency of reputation you have spent 63 years accumulating, is contingent on none of this becoming public. He looked at her with the complete, unadorned attention of a man who has finished calculating and is now simply conveying the result. I can make all of it public in 72 hours, or I can do something else. This isn't business, she said. Her voice had changed. Not broken, Mayang Yongsuk did not break, but something had evacuated it, the performance layer, the 41 hours of preparation. What remained was the voice of a woman speaking without the architecture. Is it? This isn't business, Tak said. This is personal. He said it the way he'd said everything in this room, without heat, without the gratification of anger performed for an audience. Cold and exact and final. You decided, he said, that my daughter's existence was a variable you had the authority to manage. You built a system to ensure she remained invisible to me. You surveilled her childhood, intercepted her access to her own father, and compromised my organization to do it. And when that system became vulnerable, its architecture was used to circulate a photograph of a 4-year-old child through criminal networks. He leaned back. So, no, this is not business. Mayang Yongsuk looked at the river. For a long moment, she said nothing. When she looked back, something in her expression had shifted in a way that was not submission. She was not a woman who submitted, but acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement of someone who has, for the first time, fully seen the shape of what they built and cannot rearrange it into something defensible. What does the something else look like? She said. 11 investment positions are frozen as of close of business today, Tak said. My financial team has already initiated the process through the relevant holding structures. Your lawyers will receive confirmation within the hour. They remain frozen until Attorney Wu's office receives a complete, signed account of every instruction you gave regarding the surveillance operation, every communication with Do Wansu, every direction given to Ryun and to Gong Ae Rai. He paused. Complete means complete. Wu will know if it isn't. And if it is complete, the positions are unfrozen. The legal documentation is held, not destroyed, held in Attorney Wu's office under a sealed arrangement. You retain your standing. You retain your access. He looked at her. And you remove yourself entirely and permanently from any proximity to my daughter's life, my organization, and any future decisions regarding either. You're not going to the authorities, she said. It was not a question. She was reading the terms. The authorities would require a public process, Tak said. A public process would expose details of my organization's internal structure that serve neither of our interests. I am not offering you this arrangement as a mercy. I am offering it as the most efficient resolution of a situation that benefits from discretion. Mayang Yongsuk looked at the 3 documents on the table. At the commission log, the forged memo, the financial record. 14 months of architecture laid flat on a table in a room with no audience. Veronica, she said. Veronica's situation is separate and being managed separately, Tak said. Your cooperation has no bearing on her process, and hers has no bearing on yours. Something moved through her expression at this. A recognition, perhaps, that the wall she had built between herself and consequence, by routing everything through her daughter's engagement, had not, in the end, protected either of them. "I'll have my lawyers contact Attorney Wu by morning," she said. Tak stood. He gathered the 3 documents from the table, aligned them precisely, and returned them to his jacket. He looked at her once more, at the woman who had sat in the front pew of a cathedral in steel-gray silk and manufactured tears, while the apparatus she'd built ran quietly in the background, intercepting letters and watching a child in a red coat climb bars in a park through a long lens from behind a hedge. "One more thing," he said. "The photograph that was circulated through Beek's network, every copy, every channel, every archive it touched. Your lawyers will assist my team in tracing the full distribution, not because it changes the arrangement, because that photograph does not exist in the world anymore, not in any form, not anywhere." Mayung Yongsuk looked at him. "That's beyond my—" "Find a way," he said. "That is not a negotiating point." He walked to the door. His hand was on the handle when she spoke. "I believed I was protecting the organization," she said, not defensively, in the tone of someone making a final, honest accounting of their own position. "I want you to know that. I believed the child was a distraction that would make you vulnerable. I was trying to protect the structure." Tak looked at the door. "The structure," he said, "was never yours to protect." He opened it and walked out. In the elevator, descending, he stood with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the floor indicator, and understood that the woman in the room above him would spend the rest of her life in the precise, circumscribed future he had just described to her, not destroyed, not imprisoned, but contained. Operating within boundaries she could see clearly and could not cross. It was not the most satisfying resolution he had ever engineered. It was the correct one. "I own your future now. This isn't business, it's personal." The elevator reached the ground floor. Outside, his phone showed a message from Cheryl. "Sorry, drew a picture today. She said it was the tall man from the park. I'm sending it." The image loaded slowly. A child's drawing, crayon, the proportions approximate and gloriously indifferent to accuracy. A tall figure with black marks on the neck, 2 oversized hands, and beside the figure, added in a different color as an afterthought, a small yellow shape that might have been a jacket or might have been the sun. Tak looked at it for a long time. Then he walked out of the building into the late afternoon, and for the first time in 9 days, the weight in his chest had shifted from the cold density of a problem to something he still didn't have a category for. He was beginning to think that was all right. The Incheon renewal was in 2 days. And Beek, who had looked at a wedding interrupted and seen weakness, was about to discover the specific, costly error of that assessment. The Incheon renewal meeting lasted 4 hours and 12 minutes. Tak had arrived first. This was deliberate, not the aggressive early arrival of a man asserting dominance, but the quiet early arrival of a man who wanted to know the room before the room filled with other people's agendas. He had walked its perimeter, noted the sight lines, chosen his seat, and been drinking coffee when the first corridor partners arrived at 9:03. Beek came in at 9:17, 2 minutes before the formal start. He was a compact man with the careful grooming of someone who understood that appearance was information, and he entered with the specific calibrated confidence of a person who had spent 2 weeks building toward this room and believed the architecture was in his favor. He looked at Tak already seated at the head of the table and recalibrated in a fraction of a second. Tak watched him do it, watched the micro-adjustment behind the eyes, the rapid reassessment of a man who had expected disruption and found, instead, complete stillness. Tak nodded at him once, the nod of a man acknowledging a colleague, not a threat. Beek sat down. The meeting proceeded through its formal agenda, with the methodical rhythm of men who had done this before, and understood that the real communication happened in the gaps between agenda items, in the quality of eye contact across the table, in the way proposals were received or deferred, in the accumulating texture of a room deciding which direction the weight was moving. By the second hour, the direction was clear. Tak had contacted each corridor partner personally in the days prior. He had spoken to each of them in their own language, not the language of the organization, but the specific language of each individual relationship, the accumulated vocabulary of years of managed trust. When those men sat at the table, and the moment came to register their position on the structural review amendment Beek had attempted to insert, they registered it the way men register positions when they have already decided and are simply making it visible. The amendment died in the room without a formal vote. Beek had not committed enough pieces to force one, and the pieces he thought he had committed had, over the previous 9 days, quietly recommitted elsewhere. By the 4th hour, the renewal was confirmed, terms intact, territorial arrangements stable. The corridor holding in the configuration it had held for 3 years, with language added at TAC's suggestion that tightened the structural review provisions for future challenges, language that was, in its precise technical construction, a door closed on the specific mechanism Beek had attempted to use. When the meeting ended and the room began to empty, Beek approached TAC at the table. He stood across from him with the contained expression of a man performing the acceptance of an outcome he had not wanted. "Well managed," Beek said, the specific 2-word acknowledgement of a man in this industry, not a concession, not an apology, a reading of what had occurred, delivered with the professional respect due a better executed position. "The corridor is stable," TAC said. "That serves everyone at this table." Beek nodded. He looked at TAC for a moment with the assessing attention of someone updating their model of a situation. "The family matter," he said. "I want you to know the photograph circulation was not authorized by you," TAC said. "I know." A beat. "The individual responsible has been addressed." "I know that too," TAC said. "My team confirmed it this morning." Something shifted in Beek's expression. The recognition of a man who has just understood that the person across from him has been several steps ahead of this conversation before it began. "Then we have no outstanding issues," he said. "We have no outstanding issues," TAC confirmed. Beek left. TAC sat at the empty table for a moment. The room had the specific quality of a space that has held significant weight and is now releasing it, a pressure differential, almost physical, in the quiet after the last person exits. He looked at his phone. A message from Cheryl, sent during the 2nd hour of the meeting. "She asked about you again this morning. I don't know what to do with that information. I thought you should have it." He read it twice. Then he put the phone in his pocket and sat with the empty room for another 30 seconds before standing and walking out. He drove to Busan that afternoon without telling anyone he was going. Not Seo, not Choi, not Philomena, who was back in Seoul and had been functioning as an informal intermediary between TAC and Cheryl in the 10 days since the cathedral, a role she had assumed with the same quiet, purposeful competence she'd brought to every other aspect of this situation. He drove himself, which he rarely did, 3 hours down the expressway with the city dissolving behind him and the coast assembling itself in increments through the windshield. He used the time the way he used early mornings, not for planning, which his mind did automatically and continuously regardless of his intentions, but for the kind of thinking that planning crowded out. The slower, more uncomfortable kind. He had been doing more of it lately. The clock on TAC's office desk chimed in memory, though he was 300 kilometers from it. The present dissolved, replaced by the memory of a sharper, hungrier time. He was 26. He had just made his first significant territorial acquisition, not through violence, which was available and would have been faster, but through a financial maneuver that took 8 months to construct and left the previous holder with no actionable recourse. Gu, who was by then operating out of a considerably larger space than the basement printing shop, had looked at the outcome and said something TAC had filed without fully understanding at the time. The problem with being very good at this is that it becomes the only thing you're good at. He had taken it as a compliment. That had been the error. He was beginning to understand, on a southbound expressway with the coast appearing in increments, what Gu had actually meant. Cheryl opened the door of the apartment above the alterations shop and looked at him with the expression she always wore in his presence. The careful, unsentimental assessment of a woman who had learned to read situations accurately because accurate reading had been, for 4 years, a survival requirement. "She's at the park," Cheryl said. "Her friend Dion's mother takes them on Wednesdays. She'll be back at 5. It was 4:15. TAC nodded. Cheryl stepped back from the door, which was its own kind of invitation, and he entered the apartment. It was small and organized with the specific efficiency of a person who had made functional choices rather than aesthetic ones. Everything in the right place, nothing unnecessary, the surfaces clear. A child's drawings covered the refrigerator door. Tack looked at them briefly, cataloging without meaning to, the way his mind processed every environment it entered. One of the drawings had a tall figure with black marks on the neck. He looked at this one longer than the others. Cheryl put water on and sat at the kitchen table and looked at him across it. "The ancient thing," she said. "Is it done?" Word reached everywhere, even here. "It's done," he said. She nodded. She looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked at him directly with the quality of directness that he had come to understand was simply how she communicated, not confrontational, not strategic. Just honest, the way some people are honest when they have decided that honesty is more efficient than its alternatives. "I can't do both," she said. He looked at her. "That's what you're sitting with," she said. "I can see it. You've been sitting with it since the park." She paused. The question of how a man who runs what you run becomes a father to a child who is afraid of him. The accuracy of it landed without softening. "Yes," he said. "I've been sitting with a different version of the same question," she said. "How I let the man who runs what you run into my daughter's life. How I manage that. What it costs her if I do and what it costs her if I don't." The water boiled. She got up and dealt with it and returned with 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat back down. "She asked about you 4 times this week," she said. 4-year-olds don't sustain interest in things that don't matter to them. Everything they don't care about disappears immediately. You haven't disappeared. Tack looked at the cup. "She was afraid of me in the park." "For about 10 seconds, Cheryl said. "Then she asked if you were scared of high places and decided you were probably acceptable." She looked at him with something that was not quite amusement but occupied adjacent territory. "She has your judgment. She makes fast assessments and then she's done. She doesn't relitigate." He looked at the refrigerator, at the drawing, at the tall figure with the black marks on the neck, rendered in the glorious imprecision of a child who draws what she sees rather than what she knows she's supposed to see. "The girl needs a father," he said, "not a boss." Cheryl held his gaze. "Yes," she said simply. "Those are not the same skill set." "No," she said, "they're not, but they're not mutually exclusive either if the person doing both is honest about which one he's being in which room." She paused. "The problem isn't what you do. The problem is if you bring how you do it in here, into this apartment, into her life. If she becomes a variable you manage, a territory you protect through the same mechanisms you use on everything else." She looked at him steadily. "She'll know. Children always know when they're being managed rather than loved. They don't have the language for it, but they feel it in their bodies, and they spend the rest of their lives not knowing why they feel hollow around certain people." Tack absorbed this. "I know," he said. "I need you to know it more than abstractly," she said. "I need you to know it in the specific, practical sense, because what I've been considering since you drove to Busan and stood at the base of a climbing structure and let a 4-year-old ask you about high places, is whether I trust you with the actual work of it, not the idea of it, the work." He looked at her. "What does the work look like from where you're standing?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Wednesdays at the park, dinner here twice a month to start. She leads the pace, if she wants more. If she pulls back, you give her the space without making it about you." She paused. "You don't bring security into this building. You don't make decisions about her life using the same framework you use for the organization. And when something frightens you about her safety, and things will, given what you do, you come to me with it as a parent, not as a boss." "And the organization," he said. "The reality of it, how do you manage that with her?" "The same way I've managed your absence for 4 years," she said. "Age-appropriately and honestly, she knows the world has complicated people in it. She doesn't need to know the specifics of your complications until she's old enough to hold them." A beat. "That's my call to make, not yours, not yet." Tack was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's fair." Cheryl looked at him with something that shifted slightly, not warmth exactly, not trust yet, but its precursor. The willingness to consider that trust might eventually be available. "One more thing," she said. "Veronica," he said. She blinked. He had read it correctly. "Goodbye, Veronica," he said. Not to Cheryl, to the space, to the version of his life that had been built on the framework of acquisition and strategic alliance and the management of human beings as variables. That's already done. Cheryl looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, with the specific finality of a woman closing a door on a question she has been carrying. The sound of feet on the stairs outside came through the apartment door, small, uneven, the particular rhythm of a child taking stairs at the pace their legs dictate rather than the pace efficiency would suggest. The door opened. Sari came in still wearing the yellow jacket, carrying something in both hands, a pine cone, held with the careful reverence of a significant discovery. She stopped when she saw Tak at the kitchen table and looked at him with the full, direct assessment he was beginning to recognize as her primary mode of encountering the world. She looked at the tattoos, then at his face, then at the pine cone in her hands. Then she walked to the table and placed the pine cone directly in front of him, with the gravity of someone making an offering they have decided is appropriate. "I found it," she said. "It's the biggest one." Tak looked at the pine cone, then at her. "It is," he said. She pulled out the chair beside him and climbed into it with the logistical determination of a small person for whom chair climbing was a standard operational procedure. She sat. She looked at the pine cone between them. "Do you like parks?" she asked. "I'm starting to," he said. She considered this, nodded with the judicial gravity of a 4-year-old whose assessment has been confirmed. Then she looked at his hands on the table, at the tattoos on his knuckles, and reached out and put one small finger on the ink, tracing the edge of a pattern with the careful curiosity of a child examining something that interests her. She didn't ask about it this time. She just looked. And Tak sat very still at a kitchen table in Busan, while his daughter traced the map of his life with one finger and found it, apparently, worth examining. "The girl needs a father, not a boss. I can't do both the same way. Goodbye, Veronica." Behind him, at the counter, Cheryl stood with her cup and looked at the window and said nothing. The choice, Tak understood, had already been made. It had been made the moment he read a name on a piece of paper in a cathedral and felt something shift that no calculation had prepared him for. The only thing that remained was the work. 3 months after the cathedral, Tak Suk-chin did something he had never done in 15 years of running an organization that required his presence the way a gravitational center requires mass. He took a Wednesday off. Not a working Wednesday conducted from a different location. Not a Wednesday where his phone was on and his people knew where he was and the operational machinery continued under his distributed attention. A Wednesday where CO had standing instructions, where Choi managed the afternoon briefings, where attorney Wu handled the 2 outstanding legal processes without escalation, and where Tak's phone was in the glove compartment of a car parked outside a park in Busan. Inside the park, on a bench, he was watching Sari attempt to convince a pigeon that it wanted to be held. The pigeon had opinions about this that differed from Sari's. The negotiation had been ongoing for 6 minutes. Sari was undeterred. She had her father's patience, which Cheryl had observed aloud 2 weeks prior with the dry precision that had become the texture of their co-parenting communication. Functional, honest, occasionally wry, stripped of everything that wasn't useful. Tak watched the pigeon negotiation and felt something he had spent 3 months learning to identify because it had no antecedent in his previous life. It was not happiness exactly. Happiness was too simple a word for something with this much texture. It was closer to the sensation of a frequency interference resolving. 2 signals that had been competing finding, not harmony, but a workable coexistence. He was not a different man. He had been clear-eyed about this from the Wednesday in the apartment when Sari put her finger on the ink of his knuckles. The organization existed. The territorial arrangements existed. The specific nature of his life and what it required existed. He had not dismantled any of it. Dismantling it would have created a power vacuum that endangered more people than it protected. And he was honest enough with himself to know that the monk's narrative, the criminal who walks away clean, was a fiction that served storytellers more than it served reality. What he had done was something more architectural and more difficult. He had separated the rooms. The restructuring had taken 6 weeks and had been the most technically demanding thing he had executed in a decade, which was saying something given what the previous decade contained. The syndicate's operational leadership had been redistributed across a 3-person council: CEO, Choi, and a senior logistics director named Ban who had been underleveraged for years and received the expansion of his role with the contained enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting for it without allowing himself to want it too visibly. TAC retained strategic oversight and final authority on decisions above a defined threshold. Below that threshold, the council operated. This was not retirement. It was not weakness. It was, as he had explained to the council in the single meeting where he laid out the restructuring without taking questions until he had finished, the difference between a system that depends on a single point of failure and a system that is resilient. He had framed it operationally because that was the language the room understood, and because it was true, the framing was not a disguise for a personal decision, but an accurate description of what the personal decision had produced. The corridor partners had received the news with the careful neutrality of men processing a development that required reassessment. None of them moved against it. The Inchin renewal had settled the question of tax position definitively enough that the restructuring read as evolution rather than retreat, and men who operated in these environments understood the difference. Beek had said nothing publicly. This was the most meaningful response available to him. There is something worth sitting with here, something that extends beyond this story into every life where power and love compete for the same space. The belief that strength requires totality, that to be formidable you must be singular, that distributing your authority is the same as losing it. This is the lie that the most capable people tell themselves longest, because their capability makes it feel like truth. The restructuring of a life, any life, not just one built on the architecture of a criminal empire, begins the moment you accept that the thing you built to protect yourself has started costing more than it provides. That is not weakness discovering itself. That is intelligence, finally, catching up. The pigeon had escaped. Sari stood watching it go with her hands on her hips in the posture of someone filing this outcome for future strategic revision. Then she turned and walked back to the bench with the purposeful stride of a small person who has concluded one agenda item and is moving to the next. She climbed up beside TAC. She had stopped negotiating the climb. 3 months of Wednesdays and twice-monthly dinners had resolved the chair climbing and bench climbing into automatic, unconsidered movement, the body's acknowledgement that this was familiar territory now. She looked at the pigeon's last known location. He didn't want to be picked up, she said. No, TAC agreed. I was going to be very gentle. I know. She considered the injustice of this for a moment. Then she looked at his hands on his knees, at the tattoos, which had long since stopped being remarkable to her, and had become simply the visual texture of his hands, the way certain people's hands have calluses or rings or particular shapes that become part of how you know them. Appa, she said. It was the first time she had said it without the slight hesitation that had preceded it for the first 2 months, the quarter-second pause of a child trying on a word to see if it fit before committing to its full weight. Today it arrived without pause, without test. Just the word, used the way you use words that have become furniture, present, functional, not requiring examination. Something moved through TAC's chest that he had learned, over 3 months, not to try to contain or categorize or process into something manageable. He let it move. Yes, he said. Is the park going to be here next Wednesday? Yes. And you're coming. Is he coming back? Yes, he said, always. She received this with a nod, the judicial nod he had come to understand as her primary register of satisfied assessment, and looked back at the park with the proprietary interest of someone surveying familiar territory. A sparrow landed near the climbing structure. She watched it with the focused attention of a child already formulating a revised approach to the bird diplomacy problem. TAC looked at the park. At the ordinary Wednesday afternoon of it, 2 other families, a man reading on a bench at the far end, the late autumn light coming through the trees at the angle that flattered everything. He had sat in rooms where decisions were made that restructured the economic infrastructure of entire districts. He had negotiated under conditions of genuine physical danger with men who considered violence a primary language. He had built, across 15 years, a position of such comprehensive authority that even the people who wanted to dismantle it had learned to approach it with respect. None of it had produced anything that felt like this. A new kind of power. Not the power of control, which he had understood since 23. Not the power of resource, which he had built methodically and defended consistently. Something quieter than either. Something that didn't require defending because it didn't present itself as a position to be challenged. The power of a Wednesday afternoon. Of a word used without hesitation. Of a pine cone placed on a kitchen table by small hands as a considered offering. He had no framework for it because nothing in the previous 15 years had required him to develop one. He was building the framework now, week by week, dinner by dinner, pigeon negotiation by pigeon negotiation, in the imprecise and patient way that frameworks built from experience rather than calculation are always built. That evening, after he had dropped sorry at the apartment and exchanged the brief, functional debrief with Cheryl that had become their standard Wednesday closing. She ate well. She's been sleeping better. She told her teacher her father has drawings on his hands, and the teacher apparently found this information concerning. He sat in the parked car outside the building for a few minutes before driving. He looked at his phone. There was a message from Choi, operational, routine, the kind of thing the council now handled, but flagged upward as a matter of information rather than decision. He read it and replied with 2 words that resolved it and put the phone down. He looked at the blue awning of the alterations shop below the apartment. The hand-lettered sign. The light on in the window above, where Cheryl was putting Sari to bed through the particular logistical complexity of bedtime with a 4-year-old who had opinions about the number of stories required. He thought about Veronica, not with the weight the thought had carried in the first weeks, but with the cleaner, less personal quality that time and honest accounting produce. She was navigating the legal process with her lawyers and doing it, from what attorney Wu reported, without escalation. She had not contacted him. He had not contacted her. The goodbye in the corridor outside her room had been complete in both directions. He thought about her mother, whose 11 investment positions had been unfrozen on schedule following the delivery of the complete signed account Wu had required. The sealed arrangement sat in Wu's office. Mayung Yongsuk had returned to her social world with the careful, diminished precision of a woman operating within new boundaries she could see clearly. She had not tested them. He thought about Philomena, who had returned to a version of her ordinary life with the particular, earned exhaustion of someone who has completed a very long mission and is relearning what ordinary costs. He had ensured she was compensated, not as a transaction, but as the acknowledgement of something that deserved acknowledgement. She had accepted it without performance. He thought about Choi, whose accounting had been the most complex of all, not because the betrayal was the largest, but because the relationship was the oldest. What remained between them was functional and honest, and carried, on both sides, the particular weight of trust that has been broken and partially reconstructed, which is always heavier than trust that has never been tested, and sometimes stronger. He looked at the light in the window, above the blue awning. Then he picked up his phone and opened the drawing Cheryl had sent him the week before Sari's latest, produced at the kitchen table during the dinner visit. It had evolved from the first one. The tall figure with the black marks on the neck was more defined now, the proportions slightly more accurate, the hands enormous in the way children draw the hands of people they associate with a particular physical quality. Beside the tall figure was a smaller figure in yellow. Between the 2 figures, rendered in careful, deliberate crayon, the child had drawn a line connecting their hands. He looked at this for a long time. Then he set the phone down and started the car. The drive back to Seoul took 3 hours. He arrived at the office building at 10:40 and went directly to his floor, not because anything required him there at this hour, but because the habit of the building at night, the particular quality of the city visible through the eastern glass wall, the antique clock on the desk, the organized silence of a space that had witnessed a great deal, was something he used for the slower kind of thinking. He stood at the eastern window and looked at the grid below. 15 years of this view, 15 years of standing here and reading the city the way you read a map, locations, connections, pressure points, the invisible infrastructure of relationships and obligations and mutual interests that structured everything visible. He still read it this way. He would probably always read it this way. The pattern recognition was not something that switched off. It was simply something that now operated alongside other faculties rather than in their absence. He looked at his reflection in the glass, the tattoos on his neck, the sharp features, the face of a man who had built something significant and was in the process, not of leaving it, but of understanding its correct proportion relative to everything else. Is he coming back? Yes, always, a new kind of power. The clock chimed 11. Tak looked at it, the small, antique piece on the corner of the desk. The clock his mother had kept on the windowsill of an apartment in a neighborhood that no longer existed. He had carried it through 15 years of a life she would not have recognized, and probably could not have reconciled with the boy who watched her wind it on Sunday mornings. He didn't know what she would have made of the organization. He had stopped trying to calculate that particular question years ago because it had no useful answer. He knew what she would have made of a Wednesday afternoon in a park, of a word used without hesitation, of a pine cone placed on a table by small hands. He picked up the clock, turned it over once in his hands, the familiar weight of it, the worn brass of the winding mechanism, the small imperfection on the base where it had been dropped, long ago, by someone who had caught it before it hit the floor. He set it back down. Outside, the city grid continued its nocturnal operations. The infrastructure of commerce and power and quiet agreements, and the full, complicated machinery of a world that did not pause for personal reckonings. He had a meeting at 7 in the morning. Corridor business, routine. A call with Attorney Wu at 9 regarding the ongoing legal processes. A report from CO at 11 on the secondary network activity that had settled in the weeks following Beek's failed renewal maneuver. And next Wednesday, a park in Busan. A bench. A small person with his jaw and her mother's eyes and a comprehensive ongoing interest in bird diplomacy. Both things, the same life, different rooms. That was the new kind of power, not the elimination of complexity, which was a fantasy, but the capacity to hold it without letting it collapse into a single dimension. To be the man the eastern window reflected, and also the man who sat on a park bench and said yes, always without calculation. He had not fully arrived at it. He was honest about this. The work Cheryl had described at the kitchen table, patient, specific, led by a child's pace rather than his own, was ongoing and would be ongoing for years, and would require him to fail at it periodically and return to it anyway, which was perhaps the most foreign requirement the whole of it placed on him. He had spent 15 years building things that didn't require him to return after failure. He was learning a different construction. The clock read 11:07. Tak turned off the desk light. He stood for a moment in the dark with the city lit behind the glass wall, the grid of it, the 10,000 illuminated windows of a place he had spent half his life learning to navigate. Then he picked up his jacket and walked to the elevator. Behind him, on the desk in the dark, the clock kept its time. Ahead of him, 300 kilometers south, a child slept in a yellow jacket hung on a chair beside her bed, dreaming whatever 4-year-olds dream when the week has contained a park and a pigeon and a tall man with drawings on his hands who said he was coming back. He was. A new kind of power, the altar of the old life, left standing but no longer occupied. The new one, built low to the ground at the height of a child. That was enough. That was, it turned out, considerably more than enough.